mutes, the questions, the speaker view. Those were my main things that were logistics. So awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming, everybody. I am really excited. I'm going to say I'm a little bit, I think I'm in that place where I'm feeling a little bit nervous because I'm so excited to talk to you, Lisa. I came across Lisa's work earlier this year when I was in a training with Amy Glenn about holding space for pregnancy loss, and have just been so moved by this book that you wrote and how well your work has resonated with my work and my pathway to this work. I feel a little nervous tonight in a good way, in a way that's sort of lifting me up to be my best. So thanks for that. For those of you that don't know, Elizabeth Heineman is the author of Ghost Belly, a memoir of her 2008 stillbirth. She's a professor of history and gender, women's studies, and sexuality studies at the University of Iowa. She's a political activist and a parent to 2 surviving children. We're really, really lucky to have her here tonight. Before we jump in, because I want to bring some contrast, if you don't mind, Lisa, I'm just going to give a really quick story of how I came into this work, because it was through a stillbirth that didn't have the amazing options, not my own stillbirth, a family that I was serving as their midwife. And when my client's baby died at 38 weeks, we knew before the birth that the baby was going to be born dead. And we went to the hospital, and there was like this screaming intuition in me that said, she needs to bring the baby home. This was before I'd heard of the National Home Funeral Alliance or anything. She needs to bring the baby home. And we didn't. And I didn't bring it up because I didn't have a good relationship with the hospital. And I've watched that family struggle on a lot of levels, socially and with addiction and things like that. And so I've always questioned how it would have been different. So, you know, my hope for the evening really is to let Thor's story inspire our work as home funeral guides, sort of in contrast to what I experienced. So that as home funeral guides, we really remember that our job is to advocate and to educate so that more families that are facing stillbirth and infant loss can have experiences like the one that Lisa's going to share with us tonight. So again, just thanks everyone for the courage to show up, and thank you, Lisa.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dani. Thank you, Dani, so much for inviting me. I've really been moved by Amy Glenn's work, and I was so thrilled to have you reach out to me. And I'm really, really happy to speak with this group and to just have an hour and a half of conversation with you. You know, as you'll learn in the course of our conversation, I came across the opportunity to take Thor home really quite by accident, and it could very well not have happened, and I'm so glad it did. And one thing that's been so clear to me since then is how important it is for caring professionals, whether they're midwives or doulas or nurses or various people who accompany us, to know ahead of time what the range of options are. So if it should come up, it's not a matter of chance whether somebody finds out that this option is available to them. It's not going to be what everybody wants to do, but for those for whom it is the right thing, it would be a terrible loss not to have it. So I'm just so thrilled by the work of the Home Funeral Alliance and everything that is happening to make the whole process of grieving and being present with the loved one who's gone, just so much more of a holistic experience and more of a connected experience. I think it's really amazing work.
Thanks. So before we get started really with my questions and some of the readings I want you, I just want to check in with you about how you're doing. I know that this can be a hard thing to talk about. It can be a healing thing to talk about. And so will you just give us a little reading of where you're at with it? If there's anything that you want me to know as far as, you know, talking about it, things I should be aware of, let us in on that a little bit.
I really appreciate that. I mean, I usually say up front that I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't feel comfortable talking completely openly, having all questions come at me.
Oh no.
I put my, not only do I think that it's, a good thing for people who might encounter situations in the future, but it is in fact helpful to me just to be able, because during the time there was so much sort of constraint and discomfort and inability to be honest, that opportunities to do that for me are just wonderful, and I'm really grateful. So I hope that all of you will feel free to speak honestly. Um, don't worry about hurting my feelings. I've heard it all. But those are exactly the conversations I want to have.
Awesome. So would you want to start with just, hopefully some people have read your book and the article that we shared, but would you just tell us, like a brief overview of your experience and how it started and where you ended up, and we'll go from there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was I had a 16-year-old child at the time I had my second pregnancy, and that's important. This had been from a previous relationship. We had a very good relationship still post breakup, but I was in a new relationship and very much wanted to have a child in that relationship, and so did my partner. Um, and I got pregnant at advanced maternal age, but it was a low risk pregnancy. I mean, basically, I was seeing hospital midwives. They confirmed that it's not really about the age; it's about the high blood pressure, the diabetes, and all these things. So I then opted for an out of hospital birth. I'd had that with my first child. It had been a splendid experience, and I opted for an out of hospital birth again. This one, for reasons that I end up exploring in the book. I can go into some detail if you want me to, but my sense is that might not be the focus tonight. Basically, the pregnancy was very healthy, and then there was a catastrophic labor and delivery, and a sudden placental abruption, and Thor was then born dead after going into labor quite naturally, with what started out like as a very healthy labor as well. In any case, after that, of course, since I was out of hospital, I was rushed to the hospital. EMT was there. Were working with me. They were working with Thor to try to revive. Hi there. It sounds like I might have been disconnected briefly.
You're having a little bit of internet issue, but it keeps coming back pretty quickly when it happens.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll just keep rolling with it. It's all good.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay. I'm just going to get the gallery view here. In any case, while I was in the hospital, eventually, they'd separated Thor. He was elsewhere. And somebody from one of the offices or other of the hospital came and asked whether I wanted to see Thor and told me I could have him for half an hour. And I said, that's not enough, because it was 4 a.m. And I wanted my older son to have the opportunity to come in if he wanted to see him. I wanted my ex to be able to come in. So I kind of had to advocate for myself right then and there. And this is barely, 3 hours after the delivery, to basically say, listen, I want him longer. And he sort of had kinds of excuse, well, it's not policy, it's not standard procedure. And I said, like, why not? And eventually he basically came back and said, okay, you can have him for like 6 hours. So fine. So I spent some time with him then in the hospital, which was very, very important. And again, it wasn't super short. It was a good 6 hours, really spent time. And then he was taken away from me, and I thought that was that. I thought I was leaving him, forever. Then I ended up, basically we made arrangements with a funeral director, and it was the funeral director who informed me of the possibility of seeing Thor again, visiting with him in the funeral home, and also taking him home with me. And I'm, like I say, purely by chance, I could have chosen a different funeral home, right? This guy is the hero in my book. And every time I give readings for this book, people want to meet Uncle Mike, because he's just a delightful human being, and he was so important to the story. So then I ended up taking him home a couple of times, a couple of overnight stays. And again, very, very important to me. I also very quickly started writing. I'm an academic, so I kind of write for a living, but I write academic stuff. I've never been a creative writer. I've never kept a journal before, never did kind of personal writings. And all of a sudden, I was doing that. So the article you read in the book that's there, they now kind of do the work of communicating with other people and accompanying other people who might be, you know, thinking about the subject either from their own personal grief or because they're in the helping professions. At the time, the activity of writing was very much sort of part of my own healing. I grieved very thoroughly. I spent 18 months on it. I also had a job. I had another kid. I was doing other things, but I did not shortchange the grieving process, and I was very grateful that I kind of had the space to do that, both the personal space, the people who were around me who were supportive of that, and just the nature of my job was such that I had some flexibility. I didn't have to be in the office from 8 to 5, 2 weeks after the baby's death, that sort of thing. Um, so that's what came out of it was there was this book that was published a few years later. And also along the way, of course, I did do a fair amount of speaking. I spoke with doulas, I spoke with midwives, I spoke with home funeral professionals and guides, um, to sort of help me think more deeply about the whole experience, but also to help to communicate to other people, how we might create a more humane process.
That's great. So I'm gonna a little bit intro. I'm gonna ask just so you can prepare. I'm gonna ask you to do the reading from page 104 about saying hello. And what I wanted to share about that, and the reason that I had pulled this reading out was because I think a lot, not all by any means, but a lot of times home funeral guides and death doulas are really working in hospice situations. Not always, but so much of the time. And so we're really working with families to figure out positive ways to say goodbye, and lengthening that time at end of life so that there's a meaningful way to say goodbye, and to slow down the change so that the body has some time to integrate the loss. But a lot of times in the home funeral guide world, I feel like we're talking about the goodbye so much. And what I think we forget, and what I learned with the language that I learned from reading your book that makes so much sense, is that need to say hello. That element for people who are losing a baby is that they haven't ever gotten to say hello. So saying goodbye is premature. So if you wouldn't mind,
Yeah.
your writing on that aspect of it is so perfect. Lisa's going to read to us from her book, Ghost Belly. I'm going to hold it up here if anybody who can see me. And she's going to read to us, if people have it in front of them, it's from page 104. And I figure read 104 to 105 a little bit. And you'll just hear her words about the importance of saying hello before you say goodbye.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate your saying that, because I think it's absolutely right that most people who are sort of death doulas or some variant of that, infant death or stillbirth is a small subsection of that, and it's not usually the first thing people are trained in, but it is this incredibly important world of death that that we neglect to think about it because it's so hard to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let me read a little bit. This is in the hospital, and this is after I'd kind of had my little argument, and said, yeah, I want to see him and I want him longer. When they bring Thor to me, I feel all the tension of the last hours slipping out of the room like a sigh. Finally, we've arrived at our destination. This is our destination. I can hold Thor in my arms. This is what I've been waiting for 9 months. This is what's been imminent since I went into labor a few hours earlier. This moment was delayed because all sorts of other things have gotten in the way. The EMT people taking Thor downstairs to the kitchen, the ambulance ride, the light blue hordes palpating my belly, Glenn going to see Thor separately, my having to argue with the man from the medical examiner's office. But finally, the moment has arrived. I can have Thor. There is something terribly elemental about that moment, about looking forward to it in the few minutes between my conversation with the boss from the medical examiner's office and the time they bring Thor. Something so elemental that even death doesn't get in the way. Thor was inside me, and now he is rightfully outside. He's outside, but he belongs in my arms, cradled naked against my breast, just a rib cage away from where he's been curled up all those months. Once upon a time, stillborn babies were whisked away and the parents didn't even see them. But now hospitals have changed their practice, and parents can have and hold their stillborn babies to say goodbye. No one seems to have thought of the fact that first the parents have to say hello. Perhaps that's why they think half an hour is enough, but we have 6 hours. Thor will not change during those 6 hours. He will not be freshly born when I get him, then 6 hours old when I give him back. He will not be awake, then asleep. He will not first be unwashed, then washed, first hungry, then sated, first crying, then content, then crying again. He will be exactly the same at the end of the 6 hours as he was at the beginning. Just a little cooler, a little stiffer, but we aren't thinking about that. And so the 6 hours will be a moment, not an expanse of time. But it will be a moment that will stretch out like silly putty that resists snapping as you stretch it farther and farther. And even though you know it won't stretch forever, for the moment, what's amazing is that it stretches as far as it does. This is what I want to do in those 6 hours, to take that moment in which Thor will not grow 6 hours older and inhabit it fully, to fully absorb Thor, because this will be our only chance. So why don't I stop there?
Yeah. It's so powerful. And I love really the way that you keep going back to that idea of making memories, you know, that the hello is a hello, and it's the only opportunity that you have to make memories with your child, you know, before you have to say goodbye. And I just, as you know, we're still in the hospital here at this point in your story, but I think that all of us would agree as home funeral guides that really what we're about isn't this specific element of defining it as a home funeral, but encouraging families to spend time with those bodies. And I think you just said it eloquently. I really appreciate that. What qualities do you think that you have that allowed you to say yes and to really have that the energy and the confidence to advocate for yourself in that way? Because so many times that's really not the issue. That's not the way it is.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to a lot of other, grieving parents. Of course, I've talked to a lot of women in the meantime who have had miscarriages or stillbirth and infant deaths, who said they just were led from one place to another, and they didn't feel sort of empowered to do that. I think it didn't hurt that I was older, frankly. I think it didn't hurt that I already was had been through the experience of, in a sense, being independent enough to wish for an out-of-hospital birth and push for that. My first one was in Germany. My second one was in Iowa. So I kind of had to navigate systems of doing something that was a little bit off the beaten path anyway. My first child was with another woman. So I'd had to navigate that world of doing things off the beaten path and advocating for myself. And we had advocated with teachers for understanding how to talk to classrooms about two moms and all that kind of stuff. So I had a couple decades of practice of advocating for myself by then, and it really served me well. So part of what I want to say is raise strong girls, period, because you never know when you're going to need that, right? But not everybody's in that situation. And I've talked to so many women who, were 19 or 20 or 21 or 22 years old, first pregnancy, felt so vulnerable, and just didn't feel like it was their place to ask any questions. So that's why really well-informed and sensitive guides are so important.
Right. So often in the hospital, I think that's the MO, as a home birth midwife, I see it because we switch, we can be at home, and then if there's a transport and we end up in the hospital, it's like even the midwives, sometimes we end up like having to use all the force that we can muster to find our voices to advocate there. So I think in this moment, I want to just address the group and say, as I said, what I hope for this evening is that we get a little bit of inspiration to realize that our work as home funeral guides is as advocates. And so this is one of those moments where I want to say, wouldn't it have been great if they said, you can have your baby for as long as you want. In fact, you can take your baby home with you because that's legal. And So if anybody's taking notes or mental notes or notes in their heart, this is that moment to sort of swallow and let it become a little bit of a medicine in you to start to figure out what are the things, and we can talk about it more as the evening goes on, but what are the things that you can be doing where you live to check in with your hospital, to educate, you know, and maybe try to influence hospital policy so that women who aren't quite as strong as Lisa in that moment that they arrive at the hospital can find that they don't, that you've done the work for them. So let's focus on that a little bit as our work going forward.
One thing I should say real quickly is that the laws actually differ from state to state.
Yeah.
So the first thing you need to know is what are the laws in your state.
Right.
And then also who are your allies, right? So if you've got a client who would like to take their baby home, let's say it's a baby situation, but perhaps you're in a state where they still have to be officially working with a funeral home. What funeral home is going to be sympathetic and sensitive to that? So developing those networks and finding out who the allies are right in the community is pretty important.
That's so well said, because what we always try to remind people here with, you know, with the NHFA is that in every state, it's legal to have your baby home with you. In some states, you need a funeral director to bring the baby home from the hospital for you, but then they can give you your baby at your home by yourself in every state the way you did, but it's just that transport factor. And so I agree, making those good relationships with funeral directors where you live is a really important aspect to that. Working with the hospital so they can help you know what your options are, and then making sure that you have good relationships with funeral directors where you live so that they are willing to say, of course, I'll go pick up that baby's body and bring it home. In Phoenix, Arizona, there's actually a funeral director who's working on starting a nonprofit so that he can, for free, be the funeral director that picks up babies and encourages families to bring them home on his own. And this is a, you know, conventional mainstream funeral director that's willing to do that. So they're out there. We just have to find them. Yeah. Would you
right.
Would you like to read to us about Uncle Mike? Can you hear me?
Sure. I love Uncle Mike.
I love Uncle Mike. Do you have the page that he's on? He's on page 125. Uh-oh.
I think it's
125.
Okay. Yeah. So, right. I'm going to, let's see. I'm going to start a little bit earlier, if you don't mind.
Great.
I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm going to read a few little chunks from chapter 4, just so we sort of get to what my mind space was and his part in turning that around, because it's not just, the thing with Uncle Mike is it's not just that he was willing to be a resource. It's his humor, his sense of humor. I mean, he was just a mensch. Iowa City is a 2-funeral home town. When they'd asked the hospital which funeral home we wanted, we'd picked Lansing because everyone we knew who had died had gone there. And so after a wordless breakfast, we drove to Lansing. This is what you do the day after you have a baby. You go to the funeral home. From the outside, Lansing looks like a suburban ranch house, a single-story brick structure with an overly generous driveway and columns that don't really belong. Inside, it's dark with heavy drapes, gas fireplaces, and framed newspaper clippings of old Iowa City hanging on patterned wallpaper. It looks like it's trying to look Victorian because maybe that's how funeral homes are supposed to look. Mike Lansing sat us down at a walnut-stained table and let out a sigh. I got the report from the hospital, he said. He was a big man, perhaps a few years older than I, with short dark hair parted to the side and rimless glasses. His voice had a soft twang. I am so sorry. Of course he was sorry, I thought peevishly. He was director of a funeral home. What else would he say? Glenn murmured a few words of acknowledgement. Glenn is my husband. Why don't you tell me what happened? I shrugged and avoided his gaze. The baby died, I said. What did he think had happened? Mike nodded. He wanted more. I told him the story that was already beginning to feel formulaic. Healthy pregnancy, no, ridiculously easy pregnancy, everything fine going into labor, that as far as we could tell, a sudden placental abruption, the baby stopped getting oxygen, got an adrenaline rush, emptied his bowels, tried to breathe, and suffocated on the feces-filled amniotic fluid. Meconium aspiration. I shrugged again. Was that enough? I wasn't interested in his canned words of sympathy. Mike folded his hands, shook his head downward at the table, clicked his tongue against the roof of his mouth, looked up and said, "That's the shits." Mike's complete lack of orthodoxy enveloped me like a blanket. He never showed a hint of the practiced seriousness that I dreaded, suspecting that's probably what people learn at funeral director school. Instead, he treated Thor as a human being, a baby human being. And babies aren't at all serious. Babies are cute. They make you laugh. And then I speak a little bit about our conversation where Mike is just so endearing about this baby. And then we talk a little bit about how we want to proceed. Do we want to have our service sooner? Do we want to have it later, meaning family could come to be with us? If we waited, we would have to get the baby embalmed. All these sort of practicalities that one has to deal with. And then I'm going to continue reading. And then just when I thought we were done and was reaching down to pick up my purse, Mike said it. "Well, you just come and visit him anytime you want." My hand grasping a soggy tissue frozen midair. I looked up at him. "We could visit him?" "Of course you can. Just give us a call in advance so we can take him out of the fridge and let him warm up. It's nicer that way." "Oh, what a little sweetie he is. So cute. Now you'll have to wait a little while till we get him embalmed." We'd decided to wait till family could come. Later on, I probably would not have made that same choice for embalmment. That's one thing that I wish I'd thought more about, but there it is. "But tomorrow afternoon, that would be just fine." I gaped at him. I had thought I was saying goodbye to Thor when we left the hospital. I was almost as grateful as if Mike had told us he could bring Thor back to life. Having your dead ones nearby, having your dead loved ones nearby used to be normal. But nowadays, you're supposed to keep corpses in their proper place, which may be the morgue, maybe the funeral home, but most important is somewhere else, away from the living. But this isn't the law. It's just that no one bothers to tell grieving families their options. Unless you discover the home funeral movement, which we didn't. Unless Mike is your funeral director, which he was. Shoot, you can take him home if you want. Take him overnight, spend some time with him. Maybe you have some friends who'd like to visit with him? It'll be fine, just keep him in a room that's cool. Our bedroom, I thought, my head spinning. We always turn down the heat during the day to save energy, and at night the whole house is cool anyway. But of course that wasn't the point. Our bedroom was where Thor was supposed to have slept with us, where I was supposed to have nursed him. This was when I understood. Thor was our baby. He did not belong to the hospital. He did not belong to the funeral home. He was ours. We could bring him home. And I want to say that sort of shift of realization, that sort of shift of mindset, and again, this is the kind of vulnerability of that moment. It wasn't clear to me that I owned that baby. It was until that moment I thought, well, I could argue with the hospital, but in the end, they get to tell me what to do. And then the funeral director would tell me what to do because the funeral director owned the baby. So just kind of the sense of ownership. This is a member of my family. He's mine. That was just an amazing kind of sight at that moment.
Yeah, I want to just focus on that for a minute because you got 6 hours with him in the hospital and he was your baby then, but what I hear you saying is that because you were still in an institution where somebody else was in charge, it wasn't fully your experience. And I really appreciate from the perspective of home funeral and what we're trying to show people is that something really changes even for your grief process when you bring somebody home and you own the meaning making. of
Mhm.
the process. You're not asking for permission anymore. You can do whatever you want with him when you get home because you're his mama. And does it feel to you like you became his mama when he got home? Will you talk about that moment a little bit more and how that shifted?
Yeah, well, I once we brought him, once I understood that we could bring him home. Um, we had two separate, like I say, two separate overnight stays. But during that time, we did a lot with him. We sort of lived with him. I showed him the house. I showed him his big brother's room. I showed him the garden. I carried him around in a sling so the neighbors couldn't see and get disturbed. I took him to the playground. I walked with him to the cemetery to see the site where he would be buried. Um, I talked to him about that. I showed him where other children were buried in the cemetery. And it it was a way of, in a sense, preparing my child to go out into what would be his world. Um, but also integrating him into mine. This was the family home. He needed to be part of that family home. His older brother did not want to see him. So he stayed with my ex during that time. Um, but to have Thor see his older brother's room and to be able to show him some of his art mattered a lot. And to be able to say, hey, here's some stuff in the garden mattered a lot. To sort of have him be part of our life, to be able to go to the swing set and say, oh, you were here with our foster children when I'd been pregnant. You were still inside me at that time. So this business of really making him part of our space and making him part of our relationships. We did have a couple of, my ex came and visited with him, and another very good friend came and visited with him. And then, so that was also a kind of an integration into a very small segment of my friendship circle. So yes, that opportunity was extraordinary, and I held that with me for a long time.
One of the things that we talk about is sort of the ritual of personhood is the language that we use around it, and realizing that biological birth doesn't necessarily make a person human, but that it's the ways that you invite them into the circle of your community and the way that you invite them into your life that actually goes from just human biological birth to being, part of a society. And I really think that what you're saying illustrates that so well. It's like you've got to have him in your home. You got to have the people that are closest to you experience him in life before he was put in the ground. I think that aspect, I mean, have you thought of it as a ritual before? Did it feel like a ritual having him home?
It was so improvisatory. When I think of ritual, I think of being part of a community, or part of a lineage in a way. I was very aware, partly because of my scholarship and my various communities, I was very aware that in many traditions, it's quite routine to have the body of your loved one at home. And in fact, in American society, until a couple generations ago, it was absolute routine. And that really stopped after the Second World War. I'm a historian, right? I'm aware of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I was aware that there were other places and other times where this was a ritual. But my own case, I had this feeling of having to invent it, but not just having to invent it, having the amazing opportunity to invent it at every step of the way. That in some ways, it didn't feel like a ritual. I was aware. I was sort of cognitively aware that this could be a ritual. And for me, I felt like I was inventing it every step of the way. So I'm not sure what to say about that. Yeah.
No, I think you answered it. I'm really curious about that piece, that cultural piece that comes through. The part of me that sort of loves I'm a historian as well, and studying ancient cultures and things like that, and primitive skills. I actually teach about home body care as a primitive skill at primitive skills gatherings, just from my background. And so I wonder if you thought at all, or if you can think about it now, like how it would have impacted your grief and that process leading up, not so much logistically, but in your heart. Like if that was something that you'd known other people that had done that, that you'd known of people that spent time with their babies' bodies or with their husbands' bodies, or, and sort of what was the detail there that in the role that it played, that you were the first. I can see it being a little bit empowering, and there's a way that empowerment affects trauma, but I can also see how it would have maybe been a little bit easeful in another way if it had been part of your culture.
I'm trying to find this one part in the book. I probably won't be able to find it quickly. Actually, yes. Okay, I'm going to read this one part, which I think speaks to that. This question of what the fact that I felt like I was doing it all from scratch, the way that impacted my experience. I'm going to read a little bit about that. This is from chapter 7. As the days passed after Thor's death, I realized with horrified wonder that I was doing something I had never done before, at least since early childhood. I was having my own experience, no one else's. I was suddenly sharply aware of how even the most personal moments of our lives are cluttered by films we've seen, books we've read. Falling in love? I've watched that movie 1,000 times. I know what the lines are. I know how the soundtrack goes. I know the facial expressions of the freshly enamored. I have friends who say that they've missed warning signs coming straight from the mouths of men they were interested in because they were too busy playing film scripts in their heads. Discovering you're pregnant, being reunited with a long-lost friend, learning of the death of your child at war, sitting at the bedside to say farewell to your terminally ill spouse. I've seen it all. We all have. There's no way to reclaim an unmediated experience of these things. Reclaim it? We never had it in the first place. But I had no mental images, no script, no soundtrack for a stillbirth. This was my experience, mine to invent together with Glenn, and in a way with Mike, who had opened the door for us to spend those days with Thor. So, it's kind of an interesting thing. I've thought a lot about this because for me, and again, given that for other reasons I was empowered to go ahead and take control, it gave me the opportunity to not follow a script, which made it that much more powerful for me. And I'm aware that part of what I'm doing now is encouraging you to create scripts for people, in some way. But of course, scripts are helpful, and feeling like you're part of a lineage and part of a community and part of tradition can also be very powerful. So, when I thought about the other deaths I've experienced, or, no, I don't know anybody. I mean, even an open casket funeral is something that I'd only experienced once. It's just so far out of my realm of experience, the idea of, and of course, open casket funeral, it's still, it's very much, 5/6 of the body is covered up. You just see the face, and you sort of keep a respectful distance. Maybe some people lean over and kiss it, but it's still very, very remote. So I did have the experience, when I was doing readings, I did quite a lot of readings with this book. I routinely have somebody in the audience raise their hand afterwards and say, well, where I come from, Guatemala, Guyana, where I come from, of course you have the person at home. Of course you do. Everybody does. And the neighbors come and we all sit together. We tell stories. It was clear that for many people in this day and age, this was something that was so natural to them. And it was just, again, I kind of cognitively knew that. I knew that hadn't been my experience. But even realizing there was this kind of connection with worlds of people that did have that experience was important for me to know.
When you were talking about the open caskets, it reminded me of the part in the book when Glenn requested that the casket be open. I think if I remember correctly, Glenn wanted the casket to be open so that everybody could see him, could see Thor, and really remember and know for reals, that he was real, you know, and that goes back, I think, a little bit to what we were talking about before too, that need for the parents to see their community seeing their child,
Yeah.
you know, is very validating.
And that's something that I think is especially important in cases of stillbirth or, you know, postnatal, you know, early postnatal death,
Mhm.
where maybe other people have not met the baby at all. And I think especially with, you know, for a lot of people, what they understand, I mean, they deeply grieve for you. They know it's a horrible, wrenching tragedy. But for a lot of people, what they deeply understand is that you were pregnant and now you're not pregnant anymore and there's no baby. So to have the baby be a real presence, not just for us, but for other people who are important to us, and to have these people know this is a baby. There's this he's got a face. You can look at his face, right? He has
Mhm.
hair. His hair is not thick and curly. It's thin and straight, right? Um, to be he's kind of a chunky kid. He's not a skinny kid, right? To be able to create some kind of individuality for that child for other people was really important. I needed other people to understand that that my grieving was about an individual, not about a pregnancy.
Well, and it sounds like it too, it gives you a memory to share together. You know, your friend has seen your baby and can comment on your baby, not this abstract baby, but this real baby. And it seems like that would help ease the discomfort too, because people have a lot of discomfort, you know, being around people who have lost children because they don't know what to say. And I think
Right.
that realness can really make a big difference. Um, so I want to shift gears a little bit. Um, I know that part of what I promised was that we would talk some logistics of how to make these impacts in the places where y'all live. What are some steps that you need to take? But I have a question that kind of dawned on me today, Lisa, and I'm really excited to ask it of you. And I'm actually not asking it, well, I'm asking it of whichever Lisa wants to answer. But I really want to talk to you for a minute as a social activist and as a, you know, as a professor of, you know, gender studies and women's studies. And I think a lot about our work as, you know, as the National Home Funeral Alliance and as home funeral guides, first and foremost, as a bit of social activism. I think that, you know, the work that we're doing side by side, holding hands with families and walking them through the hard moments is really, really powerful. But that for those of us that are called, we make a humongous impact when we take that on as an advocacy role. When instead of helping one family, we work with a hospital, which maybe doesn't feel as sweet in a heart, but is really important work. And so I just wonder if you would talk about your experience and sort of what you know about the home funeral movement, and pull in
Yeah.
that thread that you know of social justice and social activism, and how you see the two of them together.
Yeah. You know, one thing that was shocking to me, considering that I am in this kind of, you know, I was in a world of out of hospital birth and, you know, in a world of sort of social justice activism, and particularly most of my activism is not around healthcare, but because I work in gender, women's, and sexuality studies, of course, I mean, I now serve on the board of directors of an independent feminist health clinic. What was amazing to me in hindsight was that I didn't know about home funeral or alternative funeral arrangements at all. And again, it just is testimony to the ways that we just partition off death, how completely we partition off death. That, I mean, I sort of thought, wow, how do, like, I know a lot about a lot of things, but I didn't know about that, you know? Um, so, so visibility, visibility, visibility. I mean, I just feel that, you know, social justice work taught, you know, there's so many parts of it. You know, there are parts of it that are about economic justice. There are parts of it that are about global issues. There are parts, you know, there's so many things going on. Um, but at its core, it's about recognizing and honoring and enabling, um, everybody's full humanity. And the grieving process is an enormous life passage. Um, and it's about the humanity, both of the person who's grieving and the person who is being grieved. And I think that um, to kind of name that and acknowledge that is a kind of a social justice work. There's two parts of it, right? One is the very individual, you might sort of say the therapeutic thing, right? The thing about the person going through grief and needing to sort of have a process that's going to be as healthy as it can be for them. And then there's kind of the larger systemic change, right? And of course, for many people, issues related to home funeral tie into a lot of other things that matter a lot. It ties into economic justice, right? I mean, the funeral industry is expensive. Generally, I mean, there are less and more expensive ways to do it, but it's a real hardship for a lot of people to pay for a standard burial. Um, so even something as basic as that, there are ways to do it that aren't that kind of economic hardship. And of course, people don't want to think about making these decisions for economic reasons, but we also shouldn't be ashamed to talk about that. Because boy, if you're grieving and you're about to go into debt, that's not helpful, right? Um, there are environmental issues, right? And I said that, if I had thought more about this ahead of time, I might very well have opted out of embalmment. Now, that would have meant that in my state, Thor would have had to have been buried within 3 days. I probably would have worked that. But for me, my relationship with biology and the earth is such that the idea of, now when I think about it in hindsight, the idea of draining his blood and injecting him with poison and then putting that into the earth that I then plant with flowers to try to make it grow really pretty, it's okay. It's what I did. But if I were able to go about it in a fully mindful way, I would have made other choices. And of course, there is a larger impact. There's a larger environmental impact to the way we bury our dead. So I do think there are other things going on. There's within the world of stillbirth, there are issues having to do with reproductive justice, and the sort of infantilization of pregnant women and new mothers. Might be a slightly different can of worms than other settings of death. But that was something I clearly was grappling with. The need to assert myself as an autonomous adult. And that's a big social justice issue. So I do think it kind of, there's a lot going on, but I think in this case, we rightly approach it, first of all, as kind of a very human person to person matter.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. Yeah, I see, for me, so much of the foundation of social justice is just ensuring that people have access to their rights, and so when I just start there at ground zero with home funerals and realize how many institutions there are that are sort of keeping people from really fully knowing what their rights are and having access to them, like spending more time with the body or taking the body home. But that's really a place where I think that those of us with an activist heart can make a difference. And then, of course, I agree with you so much that the financial, anything that forces a family to spend $10,000, out of vulnerability is definitely something that we need to look at. So thanks so much for that. I'd love to open up to some questions right now and talk a little bit about, the ways that we can make a difference. So I'll just talk for a little bit about some things that we're doing here where I live in Prescott, Arizona. We, starting a group together of people, finding people in your area who are interested in this, and networking with people who maybe work at the hospital is a great way. If you know enough people, eventually you'll find someone who is a nurse or is friends with a nurse. And telling stories, I find, is a really great way to open up people's minds who are maybe closed to this possibility. Holding a book club. I actually, part of how I got this conversation going in my local hospital was there was a labor and delivery nurse that I kind of knew as an acquaintance, and I lent her Lisa's book. I actually bought a copy. You know, I had my copy of Ghost Belly, and I said, hey, her name happens to be Lisa also. I said, you know, Nurse Lisa, I really want you to read this book, and I'd love to just take you out to lunch and see what you think about the things in there. So, you know, I think that, you know, I was seeing this question that Sally put here on the chat. Do you have any advice about how to approach hospital administration about release of our loved ones for home care? And what I'm realizing over the years, I think, is that, you know, it's not about like putting on your smart suit and getting a meeting with administration first off. It's about little relationships and little conversations and seeing how you can shift things, you know, 1 degree, and people's minds change slowly, but it's definitely, I think, about building relationships. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
I think, yeah, I haven't done that work. I sort of decided that that wasn't going to be my contribution. Yeah, that wasn't what. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that the places where I've discovered, you know, myself having an impact inadvertently have been just, you know, really via conversation. I mean, once I had my stillbirth and I started writing about it and talking about it. I mean, right in the immediate aftermath, I talked a lot about it. I was very open with it. I became a real repository of stories. I mean, this had to do more with stillbirth than with the sort of taking the body home part of it. But oh my gosh, the number of people who came to me and said, my sister had a stillbirth. My best friend from high school had a stillbirth. I heard so many stories. And, you know, these were stories that had been bottled up. And often usually it wasn't somebody saying, I myself had a stillbirth. It was usually somebody who was close to somebody else, and they themselves hadn't known what to do. They hadn't known how to help. So yeah, I do think just the telling stories, but that's not institutions. I mean, I suspect that most of you know more about institutions in that way than I do.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that, yeah, go ahead. Who's that?
This is Sarah.
Oh, hi, Sarah.
Hi. I just wanted to mention that the NHFA has a publication called Building Bridges Along the Death Care Continuum. And it is a really helpful book. And I agree with you, Dani, like a really great starting place is telling those stories and forming those relationships. But when you're ready to take it to the next level and really advocate in hospitals and at hospices to help them create language that can change their policies that are more in line with what the law, the rights that we have. This book has, for example, for hospitals, sample letters to hospital administrators, sample body release language that is examples of home funeral friendly language, ways, how to give in-service trainings and presentations to hospital staff, similarly for hospice. So it's worth checking out if you're really ready to advocate and be an activist on that level. There's a lot of good information that we have in print for you.
And I see Kim's going to hold it up for us. There you go,
Great.
Kim.
Oh,
yeah,
thank
I mean,
you, Kim. I couldn't get my hands on that, so I know I have a copy around here somewhere. Thanks.
I mean, Sarah, I think that what you're saying is so important because, you know, hospitals are big institutions, and in the end, they all need to be trained. Like all the doctors, all the nurses, everybody that has that front line, the social workers in particular who deal with death, that training needs to be standard, right? It needs to be across the board. They all need to be informed. They all need to have not only access to resources, know what the law is, but they have to have had perhaps some training into getting more comfortable talking about it. So it's systemic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the department that I was helping a guy just over the phone who was at a hospital in Wichita and wanting to have the hospital release his father's body to him. They had the risk management department is the folks that I got on the phone with. So it's very interesting, like even the way that they think about releasing dead bodies, like, okay, this is risk management. We're going to have to hand it over to them. So yeah, absolutely. Lots of education.
Lots of education. And another department that I've found is really helpful is to get the ethics department involved, because I feel like the ethics people and the risk management people sort of balance each other out a little bit, because the ethics people are like, you can't worry about risks so much. Like, we got to worry about ethics. And sometimes if you're too worried about risks, you mess yourself up in the ethics realm. So we've had a lot of success here in Prescott, talking with the people in the ethics department, because they're helping to write protocols that say, yeah, really, this is, the law says this. And because the law says this, ethically, our policies need to reflect it. And so it's not happening overnight, but it's happening a little bit more slowly, where the ethics department is really advocating for those policies to be written. So, and they tend to be a little more down to earth maybe than your risk management types. So making those connections all over. Another great resource for what you're talking about, Lisa, is Amy Wright Glenn in the Institute of Birth, Death, and Death. She has an amazing training called Holding Space for Pregnancy Loss that I believe that you can access online, but also some of us just went through a training with her to teach that other places. And it's an awesome training for social workers and doctors and nurses and all of these people that don't know how to handle it and don't know what the options are. So something, like maybe sponsoring a talk like that to come to your town and pulling, at least some people from the hospital to attend those workshops would be really helpful. I've seen a lot of movement there.
I ended up not being able to accept this invitation, but I was invited to go to a conference of hospital chaplains, who obviously are very involved, not in every case, but very often with families of people who are approaching death. And I would imagine there might be some allies there.
I have a question for you, Lisa.
Yeah.
I love the title of your book, and I'm wondering how you came up with that.
It's the title came to me. It didn't come to me initially as a title, but there's actually, again, it's sort of a scene in the book where basically I'm taking a walk, and during the first weeks, I would sometimes kind of feel pregnant again. I mean, obviously my belly was small, but somehow I could sort of recapture that feeling of something internal there. And I just remember one day I was walking home from wherever I was walking home from, I think actually my water aerobics class or something, which I'd also done water aerobics while I was pregnant. So this kind of sort of very kind of body experience of being in the water and feeling the water outside of the baby inside, that had been just a really important kind of physiological experience for me. That I was walking home and I was able to, I sort of still had that feeling of something inside, and just the word ghost belly came to me. Can't say where it came from, it just did, but it sort of described this sort of sense of not just, this was a different part of my experience, but again, when you have death either follow birth shortly or actually precede birth, the physicality of pregnancy is still very much with you, and that kind of physical relationship to the body, the body, your own body and the baby's body are one, right? So that the notion that I had this kind of ghost belly, it's there, it just came from there, from that moment.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just,
that's a great question.
Painfully beautiful.
Yeah, I see Pashta's bringing up, the idea that, that feeling can happen with abortions and tube ligations and, all, we do a lot of what we talked about with Amy in her classes, that, miscarriages and, just acknowledging that pregnancy loss, is something that our culture doesn't really handle well. And that as much as we can do, it's to allow those memories to be made, and, you know, exploring, like, how do you do that with a miscarriage? You know, how do you, I've been at births, you know, where we're holding this little baby in our hands and just spending time even with that, making memories with that moment. I think it's all really important to get familiar with. And so I just, you know, going back to the different places where we can be reaching out, I shared in the beginning of this, you know, I was trained as a home birth midwife, a licensed midwife. And when I had my first clients have a stillbirth, I didn't know what to do. And here I was, you know, I'm not a doctor. I was trained in matters of the heart, trained to really walk with people. And I had no idea what their options were, no idea how to support them well. I made so many mistakes trying to show up well, and instead falling over and, you know, biffing on the sidewalk emotionally because I didn't know what to do. And I was trying so hard. And so I think, you know, if you want to move up, you know, to getting hospital administrators, find your local midwives, birth doulas, and invite them to a little in-service about home funerals, and that they are possible for stillbirths. Because I can tell you that, knowing my colleagues, it's so helpful to have that option to offer families when they go through that. And if the healthcare provider doesn't know, it's not going to happen unless you have Uncle Mike.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is, of course, one of the places where pregnancy and infant loss, you know, it's a loss, and it's also very different. And part of it is because, I mean, just the body is still recovering from pregnancy. You know, your breasts get engorged, right? I mean, it's, you know, you're producing milk. And, you know, of course, you're kind of flicking a switch in a way to death, but you're not, right? I mean, there's a part of you, not just you're longing for pregnancy and for infancy, but you're still there in some ways. And that's, I mean, for me, I've known, like, so many people like you, Dani, who started out as midwives and then somewhere along the line added hospice or some variant of that to their portfolio, or however you want to
Yeah.
call it, because this business of escorting people both in and out of life, is, they're very closely related in so many ways, right? A similar kind of sensitivity for both. But I think also there's, in the cases where it happens exactly in that way, the ability to have, you know, I think it's really wonderful to have a sympathetic funeral director like Mike, who was wonderful. But of course, he didn't really know much about pregnancy. That wasn't his gig, you know. So to be able to be present in the fact that until a few hours ago, I was a pregnant person, right? And right now, my breasts think I'm a new mother, right?
Right.
That simultaneous with grief is, I think we really need to think about these things in combination, because it's not just these two things that we can do both of them sensitively, but when they intersect, there is something very particular going on.
That was my experience. I mean, the dread and the fear that I felt as a practitioner, realizing that even though I had what I thought of as one of the best midwifery trainings available, that I had nothing in that moment, scared me into, not that I came into death work afraid, but just the fear that I will never, ever have that happen again, where someone is experiencing a death in my presence and that I don't know how to gracefully serve them. I'm not willing to live that way, you know? So that was like a big push. And I think that as home funeral guides and educators, that's really a place that you can make an impact by talking to healthcare providers like midwives and OBGYNs, and tell them these stories so that they can, or maybe midwifery schools, and telling them these stories so that they can experience it through your story, rather than by, you know, flailing in the room with a family who needs better support than they have to offer. I see a question here. Oh, go ahead. No, I'm going to read this question here. It says, Dani, you used the word screaming intuition at the start. In my experience, intuition is often squashed by fear of being seen as superstitious and primitive. How to better care for intuition? That's a great question. I mean, it's a lifelong question, right? How do we care for intuition? For me in that moment, I think that exactly what squashed my intuition was the fact that I felt foreign is the best way that I can explain it. As a midwife, the hospital here is not kind to us. They don't believe we should exist. And so having transported with my client to the hospital, I felt about this big, you know, and I was young. I started being a midwife young, early in life. And so I didn't have quite the chutzpah that Lisa brought with her to the hospital to really advocate. And I didn't know. I mean, that was the thing. It's not like I had ever heard of it. In my mind, I'm going, is that even legal? Is that sane? Like, do people hang out with dead bodies? Is that gross? That's the stage that I was at in my learning. And so maybe sometimes just knowledge is how we care for our intuition in those moments.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, obviously, the sort of the politics of home birth is, it intensifies the dynamic. And, you know, that is a lot of my experience was in dealing with that, and the kind of implicit accusations that it was my fault, and the fact that my midwife herself, you know, underwent a great deal of strain, when it was also quite possible that she'd made a pretty important mistake, right? And we had to deal with that. I mean, I do think that in general, I mean, even people who, you know, the OBGYNs and the, you know, nurse midwives who work at hospitals, you know, the OBGYN is supposed to be the happy ward. You know, these aren't oncologists, right? You know, and everything is directed towards avoiding death at all costs, which of course is a very noble goal, right? But of course, so many of the tensions between hospital and out of hospital birth come around precisely the issue of, well, if you're talking, the issue of business of talking about death, it's hard to completely separate that out from, well, are you accepting more risk? You know, and so that's, you know, I think that's a really, really tricky thing to work through. Having said that, 99% of births in this country happen in hospitals. So we can make an awful lot of progress in this regard, working within the more conventional system, you know, because that's where most of these episodes in the end will happen. They won't necessarily happen in the hospital, but they'll happen with people who are being accompanied, planning a hospital delivery, and then perhaps there's a fetal death before delivery. And, you know, of course, the professionals there are, all of their training is about avoiding death, right? And that's true of medical professionals in general, and it's been hard for the medical profession in general to say, when is it time to switch over to hospice? When is it time not to take heroic measures? When is it time? And then once we do that, how could we sensitively accompany people, right? So some of those same questions, just, well, when, you know, how could we?
She'll come back any second, right?
Hi there, am I back?
You're back.
Sorry about that. I definitely lost the connection there.
That's
But
okay.
anyway, you get the idea. It's just, you know, something that I do think that, particularly within the sort of birth professional community, that's, you know, again, it's supposed to be the happy word. That's not what
Right.
you're supposed to deal with death.
I was walking with a friend of mine the other day who's a palliative care doc and is also works with the ethics committee. And she and I were having a conversation because her sister is a labor and delivery nurse in Pennsylvania. And she was telling me that it's a form of hazing for their new nurses, that any fetal death goes to the new nurses.
Wow.
And that just broke my heart.
Mm.
It made me really realize that, our step one is to sort of I don't think I don't say that to say
Not
that
quite literal.
that's not what's always going on. I don't
Mhm.
think that that's what's happening across the board at hospitals, because I know that,
Right.
our hospital here takes it very, very seriously, but this is a big hospital, in an urban area, and that's how they haze their new nurses, is they make them deal with the deaths. And so I think that,
Mhm.
as we're wrapping this up and as we're trying to figure out like what to do, when this call ends and how do we make a difference where we live, is we really need to take the temperature of our institutions, and so before you make a plan to start to talk to your hospital administrators, to talk to your OBGYNs and your midwives, start asking questions, find out, that same hospital where they're hazing the nurses that way, she said across the board, they just tell people it's illegal. You can't take your baby home, can't really, you can't spend more than an hour with your baby because it's illegal. They know it's not illegal, but they're just saying that it's illegal just to make it easeful for themselves. So figuring out, are you on that end of the spectrum, or where are you, and what are the little steps that you can make? I think that, we can sit here on this call and try to figure out what are all the things that need to be done. But the reality is, from my town to the town next door, the actions that are needed are really different, because from one hospital to
Mhm.
another, their
Yeah.
policies can be really different. So figure that out, go out and have those conversations. And then, we can, you can make a plan. You can definitely be in touch with the National Home Funeral Alliance, and we can, through our books and through conversations that we're excited to have, help you figure out, what's your pathway of advocacy as you're figuring out how to make a difference where you live. But my hope is that, talking with Lisa and hearing the story, and realizing how many more layers there even are for stillbirths and infant deaths when it comes to the importance of home funeral, will really be a motivating factor for people to go out and make sure that all families have access to these choices. Are there any more questions and things like that before we wrap up? I'm seeing one here. It says, Lisa, do you think that giving your body that thinks it still has a baby to care for a purpose of pumping and donating your breast milk to a NICU would be helpful in the grieving process? Just knowing you are helping others. I'm wondering if that would be helpful or hurtful to a mom who has lost their baby. And I've heard both. What was your experience with that?
Yeah. I mean, I was aware of that possibility, and I decided against it. I mean, I was aware of it and I didn't even think about it. I mean, I was aware of it and I was like, nope, don't want to do that. I had donated his corneas and his heart valves, which were the only things that could be harvested, the only organs that could be harvested from a baby that size. And I wanted to stop my milk from coming. Having said that, I've certainly heard from other women for whom it was very helpful for them emotionally, to be able to provide milk for another baby. So I think that, again, having women know that that's an option, no pressure, it's an option. Just like, I mean, I will say that, the social worker, I was asked, as a matter of absolute routine, and they figured out good language for this, sensitive language for it. They asked, was was I willing to have my baby be an organ donor?
Kaylin,
And
stop
they
it.
and and they had to ask that right after he was born and died, right? They had to ask me, are you willing to have him be an organ donor? They know how to do that. They've worked out protocols for that. And I said yes. So that's, again, the sort of thing where you know, once upon a time, asking people about being organ donors was thought so socially awkward, we couldn't possibly do that. But they figured out ways to do it. So I think you could do the same with breast milk.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Figure out a good language.
What I appreciate about that and that question is that realizing that there's no one way. It's not like, oh, donating your breast milk facilitates grief, or donating it to, that really, we need to be so aware of all of the options, and then trust people to be able to handle knowing that they have options. I think sometimes we we don't want to give people too many options, because they're grieving, and so we'll just fix it for them, or we'll tell them what to do, and really stepping back and looking at, no, these are all of your options, and then letting the grieving person really trust themselves to know what they need and make their own experience, I think is a really great way to lean into making this a more satisfying experience for the people that we're serving.
Yeah. Let me say two things about protocols and making change in hospitals. One is that very often the protocol is to have a folder of resources available and to hand the person the folder. When I had a subsequent miscarriage, I was handed a folder. And this business of sort of handing off a folder was almost a sign of the person's discomfort. Like, I don't want to have to talk to you about it, but here, you can just like go read this on your own time, please. I mean, the folder, of course, this folder was full of really great resources, but you also communicate something to people when you just give them a stack of papers to read instead of having a conversation with them. So I do think that as important as it is to develop resources, it's important also to have part of the interaction be even if a conversation. So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing is that most hospitals, in my experience, and again, you all probably have more experience in this than I do, but I've had a few experiences in this. A lot of them have had people who have fought some other battle. So the hospital where I ended up, which is a major teaching hospital, they still have, there are staff, there's people in their OB/GYN staff who had been key players in kind of humanizing the birthing process in the first place and making it possible for partners to be in the delivery room, right? Who had been instrumental in just creating rooms that felt a little more homey. And of course, there's still all kinds of limitations to that, but that's not the point. Where the point is that there are people there and to right about families' wishes regarding heroic measures. And that means working within the institution to make change. Finding those people, they know the institution, right? And they know the business of how to actually make change in the institution. And they were motivated to do it once before, right? So those people, I think, even if they're in a completely different unit of the hospital, those people who identified a need before that had to do with just making the whole system more humane. Where did that happen in your hospital a generation ago or 10 or 15 years ago? And who were the people who made that happen?
What a great point. Thanks so much for bringing that up. Yeah, connections. What I hear you saying is about connections. Even if we're making connections with administrators, it's still about making connections and moving, some furniture of the heart around a little bit. Well, everyone, I'm going to wrap it up here so that we honor everybody's time. I feel like, the way that you wrapped up there, in talking about the handing of the folder really leads into my invitation to our next webinar next month. Actually, we will have Amy Glenn from the Institute of Birth, Breath, and Death coming and talking about companioning families during home funerals, which I feel like has an element of what Lisa was talking about, really having the courage to sit with people, to have the hard conversations, not to fix things, not to change things, but to really be, we use the term to be with people sort of in the wilderness of their grief. So it's gonna be a really great conversation with Amy. So I hope that some of you, all of you can make it. The other invitation that I would like to extend is if you feel motivated and inspired by the conversation that we've had tonight to start to look where you live and, figure out what changes need to be made and make some of those changes, I am very, very available. The NHFA and our board of directors is very available and very interested in hearing your stories and how we can support you. So, you can send an email to, the info@homefuneralliance.com or .org, and we would love to hear, oh, I took the temperature of my hospital and this is what's going on and this is what I'm going to do and I'll follow up with you in a month. It's just us. It's just humans answering those emails, and we would love to hear what you're doing, where you live, to make these changes. It's a great opportunity for us to learn from each other. And we really want to start, you know, as an organization, lifting up the work of our members so that we can learn from each other as much as possible. So I'd love to hear, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you who end up, you know, getting me some feedback from how you made an impact where you live with the things we've talked about tonight. So with that said, I will thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for your time tonight and for your amazing book and your courage in sharing your story. I know that you've changed a lot of lives, and I honor you so much for that. So thank you so much for showing up with us.
Well, thank you. And I'm so grateful for all of the work that you're all doing in your communities. I mean, it really matters to have people spreading out through the land,
Yes.
having these conversations and making change where they can. It's really wonderful to see.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you. Look in your inbox. We'll be